So as you guys know, I have done plenty of ranking videos, but I think it's finally time that we start cooking up some interesting types of builds. Now, if you did want to know about the most broken builds in the entire game, and just going over all the OP stuff in the DLC, I do have a whole dedicated video to that. So if you did want to break the whole game open, go check that out. But in terms of this video, these builds are definitely going to be a lot more fun and a lot more balanced. But don't worry, these builds are definitely very powerful, and I don't really see them being nerfed either. Now, I did try to add some variety onto this list, wanted to have one of every single type of build: strength, dexterity, faith, intelligence, arcane. And I wanted to have all these builds centered around DLC based stuff like the weapons, spells, ashes of war. I try not to carry too much stuff from the base game, as I do want to cover some brand new stuff. Anyway, let's just get started. The sword lance and the smith script shield do make for a very powerful strength based pairing. The sword lance is going to be the highest damaging heavy thrusting sword in the game, and heavy thrusting swords are one of the best classes. They probably get the best two-handed moveset, very quick poking attacks, quick charged heavies, and get like the best running attack in the entire game with that running heavy. Now, unfortunately for the sword lance, this one actually does get the lance or great spear types of running attack and heavy attack, which is still pretty decent, but I'm not going to like it as much as the heavy thrusting sword. But this doing the most amount of damage is going to make it still very useful. Now, if you don't like the sword lance moveset, that's perfectly okay. You're not limited to using this weapon. Any type of strength-based weapon is going to serve perfectly fine. But the weapon skill of which we are going to pair this alongside with is going to be a flame spear. This is a high damaging fire-based attack, of which fire-based skills do scale either of strength or faith, so it is going to be a very nice pairing. You can fully charge it for even more damage, and it does buff your weapon with plus 95 fire damage for 45 seconds. And you can also pair this alongside the winged serpent helm to actually get 10% more damage for the skill. Now, in our offhands, we are going to have the smith script shield. It is just going to be a regular small shield that doesn't really get like the best blocking abilities. You can still block with it, and you also can just poke and block at the same time with a heavy thrusting sword. I wouldn't really recommend it, but the main reason we have this shield is for its skill discus hurl. It just throws at the shield out as a projectile. Does go pretty far, does nice damage, and it also has like a little delayed effect to where enemies don't really try to dodge it as well. Now, on top of this being a really good skill, it is actually currently bugged to where when your main weapon is actually buffed, it also adds the buff to the shield projectile. So in this instance, I have Flame Spear boosting my weapon damage by plus 95, but it also adds plus 95 fire damage to the shield and every single one of its projectiles until the buff wears off. And this is going to work with any type of buff. You can even use things like Royal Knight Resolve, and every single one of the projectile attacks will be doing 80% more damage until the buff wears off, which is definitely very broken, and it definitely will get patched sometime soon. But don't worry, when it does, it is still going to be a very viable option, because it still is a very easy projectile attack that can do nice damage and only consumes 3 FP. Like 3 FP, and you can spam it over and over again. Doesn't consume much stamina at all. Any single time an enemy gets further away from you, just click the weapon skill, and it'll basically be like a guaranteed hit. Now, in terms of the talismans, what we are going to be using is the Shard of Alexander to boost the weapon skill damage by 15%. The Smithing Talisman boosts the projectile attack of Discus Hurl by 10%. The Godfrey's Icon boosts charged skills by 15%, which is going to boost the Flame Spear Ash of War. Now, this one isn't that necessary because you're only going to be using the skill to just keep your weapon buffed, which would be like once every 40 seconds. So if you found yourself not really using the skill that much, and if you feel like you needed more survivability, probably go into the Crimson Seed Talisman instead. And the last talisman I do have is the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, which is going to be more damage negation. But if you felt like you didn't really need much more damage negation, you can go with the Spear Talisman instead. That is going to enhance your counterattack damage even more. As for your crystal tiers though, you can go many different types of ways. I went with the Blood Sucking tier, which is going to be 20% more damage, but I do take 1% health per second. And being that you are using a shield, you can go ahead and use the Deflect tier, and it will just give you the ability to deflect and get more guard counter damage. If either of these crystal tiers did not interest you, then going with the strength tier or a damage or a health boosting tier is going to be perfectly fine. Now, in terms of the stats for this build, obviously 60 vigor, we're going to have 63 strength, and I'm going to have about 26 faith. The reason why we have 26 faith is because, one, we are already at a higher level. We're not going to really benefit too much by putting points into strength at this point, especially if you two-hands the weapon. So might as well just use the Claw Mark Seal, put some points into faith to use some spells. I went to 26 so I could use things like Golden Vow and Pest Thread Spears. Golden Vow is obviously going to be a really nice defense and damage buff, and Pest Thread Spears just melt larger enemies extremely quickly. Also want to use things like Flame Gummy Strength for more damage, potentially other types of damage negation spells. And then also using Blessing's Boon for a health regen spell that's going to help counteract the blood sucking cracks too. And I do also have spells like Lightning Spear and Golden Arcs, just to have different coverages and damage types. The Milady is going to be one of the best infusible weapons in the entire DLC. It is going to be a light greatsword of which they get an amazing moveset, good variety, very fluid combos. Do also get some decent amount of stance damage that can range between straight swords and greatswords. The light attack combos do about straight sword stance damage, but their charged heavy attacks can actually do great sword stance damage, which is actually really good. They also do get a wide range of Ash of War options, and also do get a unique one called Wing Stance, which this is going to be our skill of choice. Does give you either the option of a flurrying attack or a poking attack. Now the cool thing about this skill is that you can actually combo the flurrying attack into the poking attack directly afterwards, and it can actually result in high amounts of damage and high amounts of stance damage, because a 3-hit combo can hit for about 15 stance damage, whereas a lunging attack can hit for 30. And being at how far that it actually does lunge and how quick the recovery frames are, it's not going to be that risky of a skill to use. Now, being that this is actually going to be a dexterity build, we're going to have this paired alongside a keen-based infusion. It means that you can buff the weapon, of which if you do have a bunch of different types of greases, you can just apply them onto the weapon if you wanted to, although it isn't that necessary. But in our offhand, we are going to have the Ansbatch's Longbow. This is going to be a new bow to the DLC, and it probably is just the best bow in the entire game. It is going to be a medium bow with the exact same moveset as a light bow, so it is going to get the jumping and landing attacks. It also does get more base damage than the black bow, and it does get a unique skill in fan shot that shoots out 8 arrows at once, and yes, it will consume 8 arrows, but the damage is just amazing. Like, it is very viable damage, and yes, it could potentially proc status effects really quickly as well, which normally you did have to use a bunch of status effect arrows just to make bow builds viable, but you don't even need status effect arrows anymore just to get some decent damage. It is going to consume 12 FP for every single cast, and between using this skill and the wing stance, I probably recommend speccing into at least 25 mind. But any single time an enemy gets too far away from you, you can just switch to the bow, and you can get a very nice projectile option. Now in our back pocket, we're also going to have a dagger just infused with the golden vow. We just use it at the beginning of every single boss fight. It's just going to be more damage and more defenses for 45 seconds. As for the talismans though, we are going to have the Shard of Alexander, which is going to boost the skill damage by 15%. We do have the Spear Talisman as well, which this actually does boost the counterattack damage of these piercing types of weapons. So when enemies are in the middle of a combo and you hit a poking attack, it's just going to be doing even more damage now. Which both Milady with the wing stance skill and that poking attack and the bow all actually end up getting piercing damage. So they're both going to synergize there. We are going to have Rolana's cameo, which when holding onto your stance for about a second, it is actually going to boost the damage of your next attack. Now this is just going to be only applicable for the wing stance. Unfortunately, this does not work with the bow when you hold onto the stance as well. And as for the last talisman slots, we are going to have the arrows storing Sting Talisman. This does just boost the damage and the range of the bow itself. It kind of combines both the arrow sting and the arrow reach talisman together in one, but just not as much as an effect. Now if you didn't want to use a bow in this type of build, then you can go ahead and change this talisman to like a damage negation talisman instead. And if you don't see yourself using the wing stance skill as much, then I'd switch out Rolana's cameo for potentially the Crimson Sea talisman. Now in terms of your crystal tier, you can go multiple different ways. If you just cared about damage, using things like the blood sucking cracks tier or the thorny cracks tier are going to be really good. But if you felt that your damage was good enough, then using things like health or damage boosting types of crystal tiers are going to suffice. But in terms of the stats themselves, 60 vigor, about 25 mind and endurance, 70 to 80 dexterity is going to be perfectly fine. And if you're at a higher level, I recommend just always speccing into about 15 faith, because 15 faith gives you access to some damage negation spells, health regen spells, and flame grant me strength. The Black Steel Great Hammer is going to be one of the better faith-based weapons you can acquire in this DLC. Reason being is that it does come with an innate faith-based scaling and can be infused. So when you double down into a faith-based infusion, it just gets amazing amounts of AR, specifically with a sacred or holy infusion. Now, Great Hammers are just one of the better classes in the entire game. They get some of the highest, if not the highest, stance damage on average. They get really quick light attack combos, good mix-ups of vertical and horizontal attacks, and really good Ash of War options too. Now for this weapon in particular, we are going to be speccing into a guard counter or a deflecting type of build, because the guard counter of the Black Steel Great Hammer is going to be a unique AoE attack. And this AoE attack obviously is going to make it do more damage and do more stance damage. The entire guard counter attack can do 48 stance damage, which out of all the guard counters, this is going to be the highest amount for stance damage. And the weapon also does get somewhat decent guard boost and guarded damage negation, so blocking in itself isn't going to be that bad, but obviously we're going to be pairing this alongside the deflect tier, because this crystal tier for 5 minutes does make it to where when you block at the correct time, we'll just end up taking no damage, a lot less stamina damage, and our guard counters will be boosted in damage as well. And this can range from 40 to 80% depending on how many times you deflect before attacking. which 80% more damage to a guard counter on top of doing 48 stance damage. This is going to be incredible. Now, being that we are committing to a stance breaking build, we're obviously going to infuse this weapon with Cragblade. Cragblade is going to add 10 more stance damage to the weapon and also add 15% more physical damage. But the main benefit is going to be that stance damage. Now, in our offhands, we actually are going to have the Sword of Light. Now, we're not going to be using this to attack at all. We're just going to be using it for its skill, because the skill actually does serve as a holy body buff, which is going to stack with things like Golden Vow. And that's just going to be 20% more holy damage for 60 seconds. Now, in terms of our talismans, we're obviously going to have the Curved Sword Talisman for more guard counter damage, the Two-Handed Talisman, which is going to be 15% more damage as long as your weapon is two-handed. This works for all different types of attacks except for skills. So yes, this is still going to include guard counters. And being that we're going to be stance breaking really quickly, we're going to put on the Dagger Talisman, which is going to be more damage to a critical attack, and the Blade of Mercy, which is going to be 20% more damage after getting a critical attack. And in terms of our crystal tiers, obviously the Deflect tier, and we're going to have the Holy tier as well. And in terms of the stats, obviously 60 Vigor, either have 20 or 25 Mind depending on how many spells you want to use, 25 Endurance and 25 Strength just to meet the minimum requirements, and you just put all of the rest of your points into Faith. Now, being that we do have a Faith build, obviously we're going to use some spells. We don't really need much. You just want some stuff for coverage. If you do fight enemies that are like resist to holy types of damage, then using some like fire-based spells like Catch Flame is going to be good. Good new lightning spell in Knight's Lightning Spear is going to be amazing. And then when you're fighting those really large bosses, Pest Thread Spears is just going to be incredible. And also you can use something like Scarlet Aeonia at the start of a boss fight, because this thing basically like instantly procs Scarlet Rot to like most bosses in the game. It is just that good. And in terms of support spells, we're going to have obviously Golden Vow, and we're going to have Heal from Afar. This is a very quick healing spell that you can just heal yourself with, or actually heal allies or spirit summons. It gives you the effect of Lord Heal, but it's actually cheaper and has a quicker casting animation. The Dane's Footwork is one of two hand-to-hand weapons in this game. This one is going to be primarily your kicking-based one. And for a while, I was trying to make like a really good hand-to-hand type of weapon, but every single time that I was trying to build around one, it just felt like a worse version of like a fist-based weapon. But I did decide to settle on another guard countering build using Deflecting and the Divine Beast Frost Stomp weapon skill, because it has some really good synergy going on. Now, the reason why we decided to do Deflecting is because for some reason, the Dane's Footwork just hits twice with a guard counter. The Dryleaf Arts only hits like one time, but for some reason this thing hits twice, of which is doing like twice as much damage and like upwards of like 40 stance damage, which is actually insane, especially for how quick that it actually is. Now, it's not going to be broken because even when deflecting, you still take a lot of stamina damage because hand-to-hand weapons obviously don't get much guard boost. So I would say it's still pretty balanced. But if you didn't want to deflect or do guard counters, don't worry, it's still going to be perfectly viable in just using the light attacks and the heavy attacks. Now, we are going to have this weapon cold infused. Reason being is because it does proc status effects very quickly, and Frostbite is going to be one of the better ones. It debuffs enemies to make them take 20% more damage. So it's just going to enhance all of our damaging attacks by an additional 20%, as well as having the Frost doing some chunk damage. And this thing also does retain a B scaling in intelligence with a cold-based infusion, which is very good, meaning that we can spec into a lot of intelligence to benefit of using sorceries and certain magic types of skills. In this instance, Divine Beast Frost Stomp. This is just going to be an upgraded version of Hoarfrost Stomp. Does really good damage, really quick frost build up, and it can be fully charged as well. Now, this is actually going to have great synergy with this weapon because both the weapon and this skill actually get boosted by the Shattered Stone Talisman and the Divine Bird Warrior Greaves. Both of these things just boost your damage to kicking and stomping based attacks. Now, once again, in our offhands, we are going to have a dagger infused with Golden Vow. Just before every single boss fight, just use Golden Vow. It's going to be just more damage and more damage negation. As for our talismans, as I mentioned, the Shattered Stone Talisman, Shard of Alexander for more damage to our skill, the Curved Sword Talisman to just boost our guard counter damage. And in terms of the last talisman slots, you can go any which way. I went with Godfrey's Icon to just further enhance the skill when fully charged. If you did want survivability, then using like a damage negation talisman or the Crimson Seed Talisman is going to be perfectly fine. And in terms of the crystal tiers, I went with the magic tier and the deflecting tier. If you did not care about deflecting, then don't worry, you don't have to use it. It is not that imperative to the build. But being that we are going to go with an intelligence-based build, we might as well use some sorceries. I do have the Carrion Regal Scepter because this one is going to be one of the better ones to use at higher levels of intelligence without any types of negative side effects. Now, the main option here is going to be Rani's Dark Moon. I just use this at the beginning of every single boss fight, and it debuffs enemies to make them take 20% more magic damage. And it does do a bunch of frostbite too. I'm going to use Shard Spiral for when I go up against those really large types of bosses that will be very hard to deflect and try and guard counter. And Shard Spiral just like goes through them multiple times and it does amazing damage. And I'm going to have Blades of Stone just to have like a physical based option, just in case I go up against enemies that are resistant to magic damage. And I do have Glintstone Nails as like a nice projectile tracking option. The Poison Flower Blooms Twice is an absolutely amazing Ash of War in this game that can just do monstrous amounts of damage. When using it against an enemy that is inflicted with poison or rot, it just ends up doing so much more damage. Now yes, it does actually remove the poison or rot effect off the enemy, but the trade-off is just immense amounts of damage. Now this skill actually does scale off the Arcane stat and your Arcane scaling. So going into high amounts of Arcane with an occult-based weapon is going to be the best thing that you can do in terms of maximizing the damage. And being that the objective is to try and proc poison as fast as we can so we can use the skill to get more damage, it's obviously going to be best paired alongside a weapon that can get poison and that can be infused, of which unfortunately there's only one in the Venomous Fang. Now the Venomous Fang is an amazing weapon. Claws are just incredible in themselves. They get like some of the highest DPS in the entire game, if not the highest DPS. These things are S tier options. And when having the Venomous Fang Occult infused, at about 70 Arcane, I'm getting 147 poison buildup, which that is going to proc it so fast, and it's going to be doing deadly poison as well, which is just like a much better version of regular poison. It doesn't last as long, but it ticks for like twice as much damage. But we don't need it to last long anyway, because we're always going to be removing it with the Poison Flower Blooms Twice skill. And the funny thing is about this skill as well, it actually does proc rot. Does about like 100 and something rot build up. So you do have to use it a few times to proc rot. But that's perfectly fine. We have an Arcane build. We are going to have other types of sources that we can use that's going to proc Scarlet Rot anyway. But to maximize the damage of this build, we're obviously going to have to go into some poison types of buffs. Kindred Rot Exaltation, Mushroom Crown, and Poison Hand are all going to do this. Every single time that you proc rot or poison nearby an enemy or to yourself, it is just going to boost your damage. The Talisman boosted by 20%, the Mushroom Crown by 10%, and the Poison Hand by 7.5%, and these are going to last 20 seconds. And with how fast that you can proc poison and remove the poison, you can just always have this active. Now for the Poison Hand weapon, you don't actually have to necessarily use it. As long as you just have it equipped in your offhand, you can just gain an additional 7.5% more damage when proccing poison. I honestly don't even have it on in the gameplay because I forgot to just equip it. So I honestly can be doing more damage in this gameplay being shown here. But in terms of the rest of the talismans, we're going to have the Shard of Alexander and the Shattered Stone Talisman. Both of these things will just boost the power of the kick. And we are also going to have the Spear Talisman. This is boost counterattack damage by piercing weapons. And the Venomous Fang does actually get some piercing type of attacks as well as the skill. Now once again, if you did feel like you needed more survivability, then going into like a Damage Negation Talisman or the Crimson Seed Talisman is going to be perfectly viable. Now in terms of the crystal tiers, I am going to have the Blood Sucking Cracked tier for 20% more damage. Now it is going to make me drain 1% HP per second. And I am going to have the Thorny Cracks tier, which is going to boost my damage with successive attacks, and it can actually boost it by up to 20% as well. Now being that we have an Arcane build, I always recommend speccing into a little bit of Faith just so you can use certain types of spells. When you go up against enemies that are weaker to fire damage, Catch Flame, enemies weaker to lightning, just use Lightning Spear. And you can use things like Rotten Breath or Dragon Ice to just proc status effects really quickly. It is actually going to do it just as fast as the more expensive versions. So being that we're just using it to proc status effects, we might as well use the cheaper versions. And then obviously Golden Vow, Flame, Grant Me Strength for more damage negation. And we can use Blessings Boon as a health regen spell to just counteract the effects of the Blood Sucking Cracks tier. Now one thing that you might be seeing in the gameplay is me using Spirit Summons, which I typically don't do. But the reason for that is because I'm wanting them to die right at the beginning of the fight, because the Dried Bouquet Talisman does actually boost your damage by 20% for the next 30 seconds when one of your spirit summons die. So you can literally walk into a boss fight, just use a spirit summon that has a bunch of different types of enemies, and every single time one of them dies, it just resets the timer. And when all of them die, you can just switch off the talisman and you can still retain the buff. Now this is obviously not necessary to the build. You can honestly use this strategy in any single type of build, but just letting you guys know that this actually does exist as a thing. Anyway, that is the video now done and complete. If any of these builds seem interesting to you, just let me know which ones you do want to try out in the comments down below. And also please do like and subscribe because we do have a lot more videos coming out along the way. And also do follow me on Twitch because I do all of my damage testing and my build testing live on stream. But in terms of the next video, I'm not sure if I want to go cover things like the seals or the staffs or make like a top 10 best weapons or top 25 best weapons list. Not too sure. Just let me know down in the comments what you guys want. Anyway, catch you guys around.